So this afternoon, I'd like to tell you a little bit about a locality in Arizona that some people know about. It's also a relatively unknown locality in Arizona, but it produces some of the finest coppers, along with azurites and malachites and even two type locality species, which we'll get into. And so I'm going to talk today about the New Cornelia mine at Ajo, Arizona. So, as I've told any number of people in the past, I am a retired mining engineer, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds of the geology of Arizona, and that will get to the extent of my geological expertise, and then we'll get into mining history and the minerals. So, Arizona is comprised of three basic provinces. The north and northeastern corner, it's what we call the Colorado Plateau. Everybody knows about the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River that's cut down through that entire geologic sequence, but there really aren't many mines and mineral localities up on the Colorado Plateau because they're all covered by about 3,000 feet of limestone and sandstone. There are a few exceptions. There's the petrified forest that produces the beautiful rainbow wood, as we call it. There's the Grandview mine down about halfway towards the bottom in the Grand Canyon, a copper mine that's produced some interesting species like cyanotrichite and brochantite. But where we really begin to see the minerals and mines of Arizona is once we drop off the Colorado Plateau down into this central area called the transition zone, then we're able to find things like the United Verde mine at Jerome, one of the richest mines in Arizona's history. A little further south and to the east, the Globe Miami area with the Inspiration mines and Old Dominion. And then once we drop down off that transition zone, we get into the Basin and Range province, and that's really where all the mining history and mineral collecting pretty much takes place. So a bit of history concerning Arizona and New Mexico and how all this got started. As a result of the treaty that ended the Spanish-American War of 1848, the southern boundary of the United States was just on the south side of that bottom pink area. So where it says Arizona, that wasn't part of the U.S. in 1848. As the folks back then were looking at transcontinental railroad routes, they wanted an all-weather southern route, and unfortunately, they didn't get that with the treaty and the setting of that southern boundary. And so negotiations took place. There were three options that were presented to Maximilian, then Emperor of Mexico. Option one, which we now know as the Gadsden Purchase, took the southern boundary south of the Gila River to where we see that southern boundary today. There was option B was about 50 or 60 miles further south. Yes, that would have gotten Milpitas into the state of Arizona and a few other places. The third option went even further south. Those second two options, both of those, the goal was to get a seaport and access to the Sea of Cortez. Unfortunately, Maximilian wasn't willing to give that up. The other story is that as the surveyors were coming from the New Mexico corner, that they got about halfway across and they were actually supposed to parallel the latitude all the way to the Sea of Cortez, but they heard that there was a shipment of cold beer that just arrived in Yuma, and they hightailed it for those refreshments. That's just one of those wives' tales or myths and legends about Arizona. The reality is that this is the border as it was negotiated. And what's important about this is that up until 1853, when the Gadsden Treaty was signed, this was all Mexico, and there were still army patrols from the Mexican army up into this lower white area, making sure that the Americans were not trespassing onto their property. So 1853, we now own that southern part, and that's basically where Ajo and the new Cornelia mine would come about. 1854, the first prospectors came into the area. Actually, the what would become the new Cornelia mine is the very first copper property that was located, and some mining took place. It predates Morenci and Bisbee by at least 20 years, but it was out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, if you think all of Arizona is desert, this is the part of Arizona that is really desert. But by 1854, there was the Arizona Mining and Trading Company was organized. They shipped their first ore 2 years later. The problem with it was they had to haul it all by wagon to Yuma, put it on steamboats, run it around the California or Baja California Peninsula, all the way up to San Francisco. As you can see, just the transportation charges were significant. And in those days, if you didn't have any significant gold or silver values, there wasn't any copper ore that was, or copper mineral that was rich enough to sustain those kinds of costs. So that first shipment of ore, they received a check for $36,000, which sounds like a lot of money. Problem was that it cost them $45,000 to mine it and get it refined. As a result, 3 years later, the Arizona Mining and Trading Company failed. 20 years later, the Southern Pacific Railroad arrives in Gila Bend. Gila Bend's about 45 miles north of where Ajo would be established, but it's getting close enough that people can now even haul by freight wagons. Now they're only hauling at 40 miles, and that railroad went all the way back to California. But it's not until 1887 that we really see some serious claim staking taking place. Another 10 years go by, and the St. Louis Copper Company, the first real investor-owned copper or mining company in the area, came about. The problem is that A.W. Hopper was a bit of a charlatan, and along with A.J. Shotwell, they were more interested in how to fleece their investors than really produce any copper. For example, for those of you who have ever been out on a copper oxide property, it doesn't take much green or blue stain to make the rock look like very rich ore. And so what they would do is they would bring their investors out. They would have them crush up a little bit of this very pretty green and blue rock, dissolve the copper in sulfuric acid, and then tell them to dip their pocket knives in the resulting solution. And of course, the copper plated right out. Well, that's very impressive. Unfortunately, we're talking 1% copper when it needed to be 5 or 10% copper. 1909 is really when we begin to see organized and realistic drilling. There were actually 3 different mining companies that were drilling in the area, and all 3 of them were drilling in the wrong place. They each had their own geologic model that justified what they were doing, but they were all wrong. The other thing that happened in 1909 is that Ira Jureleman, one of the most expert and most famous of copper geologists, as a young, just out of college geologist, he was contracted to visit Ajo, and he's actually the one that spotted where the drilling should take place. The other interesting thing about Ajo in these early days, 1910 to 1912, is because it was out in the middle of nowhere, it lent itself to 3 very interesting mining and mineral recovery type fraudulent schemes. The most interesting was what was called the McGahan vacuum smelter. The drawing on the left is the idealized version. The picture on the right was the actual smelter that was built in 1912. The whole idea was that you put the rock in the smelter. Everybody knows that gold melts at a different temperature than silver, and in turn copper and various other metals. So the idea was that as you heated up the rock, the gold would flow off first, and then the silver, and then the copper. The only problem with it is that that's just not the way life works, and that's certainly not the way metallurgy works. But Mr. McGahan managed to swindle about $200,000 out of the various investors. The other interesting process was using hydrofluoric acid to leach the copper. Now, any of us that have tried to clean minerals with hydrofluoric acid knows just how tough that would be. And again, that one went by the wayside because it just wasn't practical. Oops. So 1909, 1910, gentleman by the name of John Campbell Greenway came into the picture. He was a mining engineer of some renown. He was the driving force in developing the new Cornelia mine. He'd come out as a mine manager with the Calumet in Arizona, learned about Arizona copper properties in Bisbee, and then learned about the mineralization that would become the new Cornelia mine. He actually laid out the town site of Ajo. Among other things, he was a brigadier general in the Army Reserve. He was also one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And in his later years, he became a regent for the University of Arizona. And his is one of the two statues that represent Arizona in Congress, in the U.S. Congress building in America. So now we come to the development schedule of the new Cornelia mine. 1911 through 1917, Ira Jereleman's back on the property, and he's overseeing the drilling as well as consolidating all the properties into one under the Calumet in Arizona. The thing about the mineral deposit at Ajo was that at least initially, the first 8 or 10 years of mining, it was all copper oxide and in a very silica-rich, very hard rock. Today, that's not such a big deal, but over 100 years ago, nobody was leaching copper, especially on a large scale like this. So Dr. Louis Ricketts is the metallurgist behind the successful development of a leaching process. As I mentioned, John Greenway is overseeing this whole operation on behalf of the Calumet in Arizona Mining Company. The other thing that had prevented Ajo from developing any earlier was the lack of water. Basically depended on rainwater. The shallow wells were spotty at best. And so Greenway decided to drill a hole because he figured if the shallow wells weren't working, maybe underlying this large lava flow, there would be water underneath. At 1,250 feet, they hit all the water that they could ever use. The water was under artesian pressure and rose to within 650 feet of the collar of that hole. Then they sunk a shaft to develop that water, and it provided all the water that both the town and the mining operation ever needed. They completed the leaching plant on May 1st, 1917, and a year later, they shipped their first copper cathodes. but they very quickly got down through the oxide. They knew that they were going to get into the sulfides. And so by 1924, they built the first concentrator at a 5,000 ton per day capacity. Now, we fast forward 7 years, and what has happened in Bisbee is you've got the Calumet in Arizona, very successful mining company for about 30 years. They paid out all their cash in dividends, but they held all the remaining ore reserves in Bisbee. Phelps Dodge, on the other hand, had not paid out all their profits in dividends, so they had the cash, but they were running out of ore. On top of that, it's the Depression. And so the merger with Phelps Dodge took place. Since Phelps Dodge had the money, that name remained, and we've known about Phelps Dodge ever since. 1950, they decided to build a smelter. That was a standard operating model for Phelps Dodge. Every one of their mining districts in Arizona had a mill, and they had their own smelter. And so all of that ran for another 34 years when the mine finally shut down. So now we're going to see some of what took place in those early years. Some of the photographs, believe it or not, the last one, those are known as the Three Green Hills. Kind of tough to see in a black and white photograph, but take my word for it, because I'm willing to accept what people said about it as well. This is what a diamond drill looked like in 1911, a bit different than the drills that we see today. And this is how they traveled to Ajo. In March of 1912, Ira Jureleman is in that car, and it's flat desert. So yeah, you have to cross the occasional dry arroyo, but there were no roads, but they just start out from either Gila Bend or Tucson and make the 60 or 70 mile trip. And this is what one of the railroad survey crews looked like in 1913. As you can see, they went back to four-legged power. So when you're looking at metallurgical testing and processes, you start in the lab and you figure out the chemistry. Then you have to build a test plant or a pilot plant. And so this is what the 40-ton oxide plant looked like in 1915. And then once you test it at a pilot level, say 40 tons a day, then you hope that you can scale it up from there. At Ajo, they were successful doing that. I mentioned earlier the freight wagons coming in and out of Ajo in the early days before the railroad was finally built. I mean, these are 20 mule teams that basically you're talking about $2 a ton to move material this way. And this is well shaft number one. This is the shaft that they sunk 1,250 feet to get down to the water. They set the pumps at about 650 feet, started pumping as much water as they knew they needed, and they never lowered the water level. This is what Ajo looked like in 1918, the actual town. It was set up in very much a traditional Spanish style community with a courtyard and park area in the center of the town, and the houses and the businesses surrounding that. 1915, if you were a single man, this is where you would have been living. The McGahan smelter is in the background. And this is what the leaching plant looked like. I mean, this is, again, this is out in the middle of Arizona desert, but by 1917, 1918, it was state of the art, especially when it came to leaching and producing copper cathodes from oxide copper. Again, drilling on the left side, very primitive by today's standards. What the pit looked like in 1924. And one of the things about Phelps Dodge, both at Morenci and here at Ajo, but it started at Ajo, was they used trains, they used steam shovels to pick up the ore, but all the ore was and waste was transported by trains, not truck. This is what the pit at Ajo and the concentrator looked like about 1950. There really wasn't much underground work done at Ajo, even in the early days. The very earliest days, yes, very small, very minor underground workings, unlike Bisbee and Morenci and Ray and virtually every other Arizona mine that would become an open pit mine. Ajo was an open pit pretty much from its beginnings. Here are the electric shovels loading the rail cars. So Ajo employed rail haulage right up until 1984. Morenci made the transition about that same time from rail haulage to truck haulage. And this is what the pit looked like about 1975. So now we're going to take a look at some of the specimens, and the premier mineral that comes from Ajo, in my opinion, are its copper specimens. And Ajo is unique within Arizona because it's the only locality that really produces what I refer to as Michigan-style copper. Ray, Bisbee are both very well known for their crystalline copper, their spinel twin copper. But here at Ajo, we get more of the blocky crystals, more reminiscent of Michigan. This is a specimen that I traded from a former shovel operator. He wouldn't sell me the piece. I had to trade him carborundum lapidary wheels because his first love was slabbing material and cutting it into butterflies. But it's almost as good a specimen on the backside as it is the front. This is a much larger specimen in the Freeport-McMoran copper and gold collection. Freeport-McMoran is bought out Phelps Dodge, and they are now operating all of PD's properties here in Arizona and elsewhere. But as you can see, I mean, this is a 15 inches wide. It's about 6 inches deep. It has some three-dimensionality. There was when I visited the mine office back in the late 70s or early 80s, there was about 150-pound chunk of crystallized copper sitting in the mine office. And the standing offer was that if you could pick that copper up and walk it about 100 yards out to the guard shack, you could just, without setting it down once, you could just keep on walking. It was yours. And as far as I know, that slab of copper is still sitting there. In addition to the Michigan-style coppers, at about the same time, and there were seams of calcite that were discovered that once they etched the calcite away, these beautiful herringbone copper specimens resulted. We don't have much history or historical specimens from Ajo prior to about 1958. 1958 to 1962 is really the banner time, if you will, for specimen production out of the new Cornelia mine, at least the start of it. That's when all these blocky coppers came out. That's when these herringbone coppers came out, the azurites and the malachites, and even some of the cuprites and calcites that you'll see in just a moment. Some more of the coppers. The one in the lower right is those are two large copper after cuprite pseudomorphs. There are the occasional spinel twin from Ajo, the one in the center that's about 2.5 inches long. There's also coarse herringbone style, and on the backside, there's actually cubic copper crystals as well. And of course, the one on the left is, if that doesn't remind you of a horse or at least Pegasus, you have even less of an imagination than I do. Cuprite is another mineral that occurs at Ajo, crystals up to about an inch in some places or in some cases, but it's not a common mineral, not as specimens anyway. The chalcotrichite version is some quite beautiful specimens of that. Now we come to azurite and malachite after azurite. In 1958 to 62, again, this period when there seemed to be a lot of specimens coming out of the New Cornelia mine. This is classic Ajo. It's actually second generation azurite on malachite after azurite. So the original crystals, of course, are azurite. They've been pseudomorphed to malachite, and now they're pseudomorphing back to azurite. Other styles of azurite that have come from Ajo over the next 10 or 12 years. The lower left-hand corner was a pocket that came out in about 1972 or 73. Very distinctive, a certain amount of etching to the relatively large crystals. And at the time, we really didn't think much of these, but as time has passed, a few of us finally recognized that we ought to at least have one in our collections. And as you can see, in some respects, the azurite is somewhat reminiscent of Milpias. In fact, for Arizona collectors, that's what we've likened some of the Milpias azurites as being similar to Ajo. Another pocket that was hit in 1972, these are the two best specimens out of it. The one on the left, or it was a pocket that was acquired by Kurt Van Scriver at the time. And the one on the left went into Miguel Romero's collection. The one on the right went into Dr. Richard Webster's collection, then Bill Larson's collection. Now it's in Evan's collection. The azurite on the left, I'm not sure about the timing of it. It's a bit unique because of the malachite and the crystallization that it represents. The one on the right probably came out in the late 60s or early 70s. Malachite after azurite. In the 1980s, Stan Esbenshade was working for Southwest Mineral Associates. They had the contract with Phelps Dodge for all of their mines in Arizona. And he collected both styles of malachite pseudomorphs that you see here. The one on the left is very unusual. It's a hard, lustrous pseudomorph. The more typical pseudomorphs are the one on the right. Those crystals are up to about an inch across. Pocket that was hit in the late 70s that was comprised of two boulders that, when they were trimmed out, produced these nice velvety malachite pseudomorphs. And I told Wayne Thompson, I said, this is the specimen that I want. And that's how they trimmed it, so that my piece ended up with one azurite crystal and the rest of them were malachite pseudomorphs. And if you look directly into that pit, about 2/3 of the way up, that's where these specimens came from. Another very distinctive style of malachite after azurite from the New Cornelia mine. You see the specimen on the left. There's secondary azurite that's growing on top of malachite after azurite crystals, and they tend to have a little manganese on them. You turn them around and you get this very nice crystalline ball that these original azurite crystals formed on, and then they pseudomorph to malachite. And we see that, and that's very distinctive for Ajo. So pseudomorph on the left, that's what it looks like on the backside. In a lot of cases, the backsides of the specimens are as attractive as the front. The one on the left is the same idea, but it's orders of magnitude bigger than any other one like this that I've ever seen. You know, if you're familiar with what cow patty looks like, that's kind of what this one does. The pseudomorph on the right is, the crystals are well over an inch, relatively large for pseudomorphs or even azurite crystals from the new Cornelia. Now we move to calcite. The calcite in the top right came from the pit. Those crystals are about 3/4 of an inch across. The one in the lower left came out of that well shaft. So it's actually produced about a half a dozen different species, but the calcites are the best things that came out of there. And calcite with cuprite inclusions. The one on the right, I was going through it spent a whole day going through the Ken Farmer collection, actually the Willie Farmer collection. His son Ken was selling it to me. And after 6 or 8 hours of looking through boxes and flats and egg cartons and candy boxes and whatever the family could find to put specimens in, I came upon this quart container, cottage cheese container, and it was filled with decrepitating pyrite crystals. And my first thought was, I don't need to look at this, okay? But I figured, well, okay, maybe somewhere in there might be a few nice pyrite crystals. At the very bottom, covered by about 100 pyrite crystals, was this virtually undamaged, almost 2-inch tall cuprite and calcite. It's the best single cuprite and calcite specimen we own, and one of the best that I've ever seen from Ajo. So the moral of this story is, no matter how late in the day it is, no matter what that last box looks like, you better dig all the way to the bottom, because there might be a treasure there. Some other interesting minerals. Gypsum has been encountered in a number of different places. A few very pretty specimens with bright yellow sulfur. Also see it with cuprite inclusions and even chalcopyrite blebs within the gypsum. I mentioned at the beginning that Ajo is the type locality for two species. Papagoite and Ajoite, again, 1958, 1962, 63, heyday of mineral specimen production. That's exactly the same time that these two species were discovered and described. They're both copper silicates. We've certainly seen other localities, especially out of Africa, that have produced far better specimens, but up until just 10 or 15 years ago, these were about as good as you could get for each of these minerals. Shattuckite, while the type locality for shattuckite is the Shattuck mine in Bisbee, generally speaking, those specimens are characterized by smears on a rock or pseudomorphs after malachite, not very attractive things. But at Ajo, they found masses of shattuckite that were cuttable, chunks and veins up to 3 and 4 inches thick, with the occasional vug that would produce actual crystallized shattuckite. Another interesting and rare mineral from the new Cornelia is a deviline, and in this case, it's rather attractively associated with malachite. And some of the material is also cuttable. The shattuckite, as I mentioned, is hard enough to cut. When it's in association with cuprite, it makes for attractive polished specimens. Copper and chrysocolla on the right. Another mainstay of Ajo's lapidary materials. Ajo really didn't produce any turquoise. It was all the copper silicates in this case. So chrysocolla, shattuckite, even papagoite. Another chrysocolla and copper in the upper right-hand corner with a little bit of white quartz. The cabochons in the lower left corner of shattuckite. The largest cabochon is about 1.5 inches tall. And so I always like to finish my presentations, especially for those of you back east. This is even more fun when it's in January, when I can sit here in my shorts and sandals and bemoan the fact that it's only 70 degrees out here. But this is not an uncommon view for us in Arizona. Probably 3 nights out of every week, we get this kind of spectacular show from Mother Nature. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I thank Ray for inviting me to be part of the 50th annual Rochester Mineralogical Symposium. Thank you.